I never expected to survive. I pushed through the pain, dragging my wounded leg, determined to move quickly. I spotted an old wooden pub in the distance as darkness took hold. It resembled a Western saloon and was one of the few remaining buildings in the town. With a sudden burst of energy, I raised my leg and delivered a powerful kick to the door. The sound of wood slamming against the wall echoed through the room as the door swung open with a sense of defiance, its hinges protesting under the weight. Perhaps it was unwise, given the condition I was in. Despite the excruciating pain shooting up my leg, I remained steadfast, determined to move forward and confront whatever lay beyond the threshold. I raised my worn sawed-off shotgun and aimed it in different directions, checking to see whether or not I was alone. It was better to be cautious than to be caught defenseless. Other than disturbed tables and chairs, there was nothing to bother me. Signs people had been here long ago. I was alone. I hobbled to the bar and sat on the last stool, placing the shotgun within reach. My heart was racing, and I found it difficult to catch my breath. My right leg was throbbing, and warm blood was leaking outside, and the pain was increasing. If I waited, it would become unbearable. I'd end up being tempted to use the shotgun on myself. I pressed my hand down on the bullet wound, knowing I had to tend to it urgently. I could feel the poison coursing through my body, causing sweat to form on my forehead and trickle down my chest. I unzipped my backpack on the bar and retrieved a stray bandage, a water canister, and spare slugs that had rolled out. I put my hand inside and rummaged around, hoping to find something to bite down on. I gritted my teeth together and let out a growl of frustration. The abandoned bar was the only place along the road where I could find refuge. All bar stools, except for one, had been knocked over. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, and deep down, I knew I couldn't stay here for very long. The wooden door swung loudly behind me, the wind blowing it open and shut, the raging storm growing more intense, and I knew it wouldn't cover my trail for long. I was being followed. It was only a matter of time before they arrived. I'd have to keep moving soon. I used my knife to cut and pull away my jeans to expose the wound. The blood was black, and the smell rancid. It was nauseating, and dizziness was setting in. I knew I wouldn't have much time. I wrinkled my nose in disgust and knew I had to act soon. I knew what it had to be to cause such a toxic reaction so quickly. I took one last breath, biting down on my bag. I cut open the wound, pushing my fingers inside, and yanked out the bullet. It burnt my fingertips. Fortunately, it barely scraped the bone, and I could pull it from my thigh. Moist and blood-coated, wriggling spirals shot out, extending beyond its form, and I stared at it, marveling in fear and awe. Technology humanity could only dream of. It looked like it was alive, a strange living creature. I dropped it inside an old bottle, and it bounced and pressed on the glass, trying to make it back inside my flesh. If there was a scientist left, they could have used it to create a countermeasure. I stared at the foreign device, feeling relief, and winced. The alcohol poured down my leg. It stung, but it needed to be cleaned. I stared inside the wound, and all I saw was blood and flesh. My blood. A thick blob of green pus poured from the wound, as though my body wanted it to return. I took a mouthful of whiskey, reached into my bag for my medkit, and cursed when I realized it wasn't there. Only a tiny case of needles remained. It must have been in the bag ripped from my hands up the road. I exhaled, tore the end of my shirt to gain a thread, and managed to thread it through the eye of the needle. Stitch by stitch, I stitched up my wound, knowing there was always the risk of infection. But the blood was what worried me most. I kept watching through my peripheral vision to try to catch sight of any movement. Once done, I leaned back on the stool and looked around. I picked up my shotgun, walked behind the bar, and tried to see if I had company. Nothing. I went down into the cellar, lit my way with a flashlight, and felt my leg ache with every step. The basement had storage shelves, some unknown tins and jars, and I could potentially get some food and other boxes. So far, so good. The stairs creaked again as I returned and checked the kitchen. Everything had decayed, but could have been intact. Once everything was inspected and I deemed them safe, I started to use whatever I could to barricade the establishment. The basement was likely the only place I could go without worrying about multiple entrances. I heard a long, wailing sound from outside, followed by a sharp yelp. Curious, I peeked through the wooden panels and saw a group of figures had cornered a German shepherd. The dog was barking ferociously, standing over the body of its previous owner, and snapped its teeth at the figures when they got too close. They appeared out of nowhere, infecting humans with their drawling moans, grasping hands and cries, crowding the dog. No one knew where they came from. One day they appeared, and infected humans were soon seen. Those who had been infected had their bodies altered. Their hands were large and contorted, elongated like a great ape, with 3 long fingers and an extended claw on the middle finger. Their bodies were humanoid. A skin fold concealed their mouth, which drew back to reveal a hawk-like beak. The dog lunged forward, grabbing on and shaking its head, causing its arm to be pulled completely off. It didn't stop them. They kept crowding the frightened dog. I knew it was stupid. I was injured and could have safely hidden myself away, but I kicked the door open, went outside, and fired my shotgun at the strange beings, blowing a large hole in the body of 3 of them. I couldn't resist a grin of satisfaction in watching their limbs blow apart. Spraying the area with blood and gore, the dog growled at me, and I struck the nearest attacker with the butt of my gun, causing its face to crack open, exposing a long, mutated tongue. Luckily, none of the sentient high-ranking officers were here. Otherwise, I would have been concerned about being shot again. There was a gap in the destruction, and I beckoned the dog to approach me with a sharp whistle. "Come on, boy. We must get out of here." The dog tilted its head and emitted a low whine before gazing at its former owner. Now closer, I could see the dog's former owner's face was ripped off, and the exposed skull stared up at me with still intact hazel eyes. The corpse was painfully fresh, and otherwise I imagined them putting a fresh mask on and rising to their feet. I walked up the 5 concrete stairs, limping on my right side, and heard the dog's claws tapping on the wooden surface. It sniffed the floor and waited for my instructions. As I entered, I started barricading the front door, and once I realized I couldn't do anything anymore, I stopped, grabbed my shotgun and bag, and headed down inside the basement. I closed the door, put a shelf across as a barricade, and waited. The dog was panting, so I fetched a bowl and filled it with water before offering it to him. It had been several months since I last had any company, and I wasn't eager to take on the responsibility of looking after something else, especially since I was already struggling to care for myself. I couldn't leave him alone. I peered out of the crack of the basement window, hoping not to alert whatever beings still lurked there. Desperately, I tried to catch any signs of movement. It went quiet again, and I took a moment to sigh. "Come on." I leaned down, my palm offered to the dog to approach. The dog stepped over, his muzzle still wet from water and blood, to inquire about me. He paused, licked my hand, and I felt around his neck for a collar. I found one. It was a little tight, and I knelt down to inspect the name tag. Victor, written in faded cursive. I flipped it over and saw a phone number that was long out of commission. "Well, Victor, we'll spend some time together. A lot of time, actually." I chuckled, loosening the collar, and figured he must have gotten it while he was a puppy. I reached out to scratch behind his ear, and Victor stared up at me. I wondered more about his previous owners. I suddenly heard a faint sound coming from above as I stood there. It was a soft creaking sound like someone was walking on wooden floors. I looked up and noticed the dust shifting above me, indicating that people were slowly moving around. I was surprised because I thought I was alone and had thoroughly checked every nook and cranny of the place. I stared up, trying to catch a glimpse of the person walking above me through the cracks of the old floorboards. The blood leaked through it, and we both stared and stepped backward. I put my finger to my lips to tell Vic to be quiet. I reached for my shotgun, and Vic whined and backed away from me. His tail was tucked between his legs, and his ears were lowered against his neck. I pointed it towards the door in case they suddenly burst through to attack us. "Shh, easy boy. You're all right." I comforted him. Victor was trembling with fear. Above us, the movement moved to the bar. The sound of bottles moving and being tossed around. It moved on the floor, sniffing and trying to find any trace of us. I did my best to keep traces of blood to a minimum, but there was no way I could have collected it all. I heard digging and scraping above us, and dust shifted. and I thought Vic would start barking. Vic's attention was on the small window. He had his eyes forward, his ears alert, and his tail tucked between his legs. "Let me in." I heard the faint whimper. I winced and closed my eyes, and the words themselves hurt. It sounded like an older person attempting and failing to sound like a child. I looked at the basement window concealed by the previous occupant, and unfortunately, the gap allowed it to see in. The eyes were human, except for the unnatural stillness. They were lying horizontally, as though the person rested their head on the ground outside while they peered in at us. Vic growled, backing up with his fur raised and teeth bared. I ignored it. I looked at my supplies in a foolhardy attempt to distract myself, sensing the unflinching gaze on me and wishing it would disappear. Sometimes I couldn't tell which ones were real and which ones were from my head. "Let me in. I know you can hear me." I inspected some jars that looked like spoiled meat inside. Once disturbed, cloudy chunks of unknown flesh swirled around, so I pushed them back on the shelf. I heard the glass crack and turned my flashlight on the other's face. It was devoid of color. The smile was too broad, unnatural, and strange, and eye contact did not cease. This one had to be real, and not a piece of my imagination. My guilt. "Let me in. I will take care of you," it taunted. I pointed my shotgun at its face, and it let out a snide laugh. "Go ahead. You'll kill me, but rest assured, you won't make it through the night." "Maybe I want to die," I snapped bitterly. It slipped a long finger inside and pressed its face through the gap. Its bones and flesh melted where necessary to fit through. These strange entities appeared around the same time the world started to fall. "Your family wanted to live, too. And you failed them, didn't you?" It knew where to hit me and where it hurt the most. I tightly closed my eyes, imagining the face of my wife and 2 children. They were smiling, and we were camping when the world changed. Our usual family trip. They were roaming the forests where we stayed, and we got good at hunting them. They were solitary and made loud sounds as they rambled through the undergrowth. My wife thought they could have been aliens, while my kids thought they were what always whispered your name in the forests. Shapeshifters or something. I didn't care about the source. All I knew was that I wanted them dead. The reports from the cities told me that they had been overrun. We survived for several months and thrived compared to many people around us. Occasionally, we saw people, helped them, and sent them on their way. They were fellow Americans, after all. We always had food and knew how to find clean water. My 2 children, Lizzie, who was still young, and James, who was 15, insisted he was a soldier in the family. We heard screeching one night and hid in our tent concealed between a small mountain and a stream of water. Since it was hidden, it was a surprise when we saw 5 beings appear and approach the tent. The same ones we saw, and another one. This one was capable of speech and had a strange gun that resembled ours so much. It shot each of my family members in the belly while giving me a slow, malicious smile. My children screamed, lifted their shirts, and tried to pull the moving bullets out of their flesh. Fingernails dug inside, yet the poison worked its magic. It choked with wide eyes and passed out. Dead. The others slept on them and feasted. I shot 2 of them, then stabbed another, and I would have kept going if they weren't dead already. My wife screamed while she was eaten alive, demanding me to escape. Finally, it was me and the commander. It studied me, and even without facial expressions, I could tell it was curious about me. I thought I was going to die. It pointed the gun at my chest, then lowered down, and I refused to give it the satisfaction of fleeing. It shot me in the leg and didn't permit the others to follow me. I could feel the bullet twisting and turning inside my leg. I ran all the way here, and I'd never felt pain like this in my life. Each bullet twisted and pushed into my flesh, gripping the muscle tightly. I heard Vic whining. It yanked me out of my daydream. That pair of eyes was close to mine. It managed to break through, and I knew it would try to feed on me. It looked haggard, and therefore had to be low in rank, and I wanted to push it away. I shot it in the face. It boomed, and the fragments of the creature burst all over the place. It flopped on me, coating me in the blood and pieces of still-moving flesh, and Vic looked at me sheepishly. I didn't blame him for not doing something. "Get ready, Vic. They're gonna come in," I said, reloading, and an empty shell fell to the floor. I was right. The footsteps echoed over the floors above and outside, gradually getting louder as they ran, trying to find us. They started to try to pull up the floorboards, claws breaking in the process, and a long, loud howl emanated to attract more to feast on our flesh. I was tempted to fire upward to break them apart, yet our position was already precarious. Vic was barking furiously at them, and when one of them dropped down from a large hole, he grabbed their arm in his muzzle, pulling them one side and suddenly lunging at his throat, tearing it open. The others made frantic sounds, not used to seeing their kinds die, and together we made short work of the three who came in. Once they were dead, Vic trotted to sit beside me, his tail casually wagging and his muzzle dripping in blood. He looked deservedly pleased with himself. It didn't last long. The wooden door and the weak barricaded items in front of the basement door came under siege. Arms reached through, and a weight of many shoved themselves against it until they made their way in. I fired randomly into the crowd, killing one and maiming others. Victor wasted no time and started his killing with a newfound taste for blood. In times like these, I wish I had time to grab additional firearms. Now, with the 2 shots lost to me, I was left to deal with the coming horde hand to hand. I didn't like my chances, but I wasn't about to go down without a fight. With insufficient time to reload, I took out my knife and aimed the tip downward. Some had open eyes and could see, while others had skin patches covering their eyes or hollowed out points where their eyes should be. They had no trouble finding me. One screeched loudly. I stabbed upward into the soft underside of their arm. The blood gushed down on the floor, and it spun around to strike me with its elongated arms. With a stumbling wince, I stepped forward and stabbed into its neck. I heard Victor growling and tearing into flesh. I listened to the ripping of the flesh from bone and couldn't waste time by looking. Instinct took over, and I remembered using a knife and fist to drive them back. My clothes were now drenched in blood and entrails. The black blood coated my face and beard. I slipped, trying and failing to maintain my footing. "Fuck!" I screamed, pushing one of them back, and exhaustion gripped my limbs, making it difficult to move. They swarmed me, and over their shoulders I saw Vic bolting up the stairs and leaving me to my fate. They weren't trying to kill me. Instead, they pulled my knife and shotgun away from me. Their monstrous growls waned when their leader approached. This one looked healthy, unlike the weak one I disposed of. The others parted to permit it through. I stood defiant, bloodied and bruised, chin raised, but it was difficult to stand, so I leaned on one of the racks of jars to stabilize myself, shakily watching, frozen in fear and feeling helpless. My heart raced, desperately trying to keep blood circulating around my body, and I felt the moist feeling on my leg worsening. It stood and stared at me without attacking or advancing. It was tall and well-built, and now, closer, I didn't notice any smell. Suddenly, it pulled off its mutated human face mask, revealing a disconcertingly human expression and features. A pair of yellow eyes, a flat nose with 2 slits for nostrils, with thin lips with sharp, pointed teeth. It blinked twice, first like a human, and then with a reptile-like horizontal eye-fold. It regarded me silently, a forked tongue flicked out of its mouth. Years ago, I would have been terrified by what I was seeing. I couldn't believe this was part of my terrifying reality. What I thought I knew was unraveling before me, or perhaps I finally lost my mind. It never looked away from me and extended its clawed hand to me, palm up in what I was guessing was an offering of peace. "I don't know what you want from me," I groaned, looking at the others. They stood still, like clockwork dolls that refused to move without instruction. They drooled, and their limbs hung limp. "Tell me." "You're a blood match. You won't be taken to the laboratory," the commander growled, not their aggression, simply the natural way it spoke. "What are you? What are your kind doing to us?" I demanded, taking this rare opportunity to ask questions. All I received in response was either a sneer or a smile. I'm not sure which it was. It stepped forward and injected me with a long, thick needle into my neck. The effects were immediate. I lost control of my limbs and couldn't grip with my hands anymore. I fell with a loud crash as the rack was knocked over. The jars cracked and spilled the foul-smelling contents. The stench was disgusting, and I couldn't even turn away. The rotting liquid flowed dangerously close when 3-fingered ones lifted me up. I tried to speak. My lips cannot move, and only a low, weak sound emanated from my throat. I screamed internally, demanding to know what they were doing and what they had injected me with. To let me go. I was not granted the mercy of losing consciousness and waking up in some unknown laboratory. I was awake for every single step and could see how badly my world was destroyed. They carried me on their shoulders up and out of the pub. It was dawn, and I could feel the chill on my skin. It was light, and they kept walking down the road I remembered running down. From what I could tell, they didn't pick up any of their dead and left them there. I didn't see any other human survivors. All I saw and smelled were corpses. They walked into one of the local cities without fear. Rarely we saw others of their kind mindlessly moving through. Perhaps they had some purpose I was not aware of. I blinked, one of the few moments I had left, and closed my eyes to keep the images out. Unfortunately, I could hear the eerie silence of a city that should have been filled with noise from traffic and people. Weeds had grown through the roads, buildings had broken windows, and there were places where battle had taken place. Hidden away in my enclave in the forest with my family, I didn't see any of this, and we were truly defeated as a species. Escape was impossible at this point. I heard barking in the distance, and my thoughts instantly went to Victor, my temporary companion. I hoped he wouldn't be found, and managed to avoid being killed. The journey took us deeper into the city. Graffiti about the end of times coated every single wall, and red spray paint was used in capital letters with the phrases, "Fight back," and "Humans rise up." One looked remarkably fresh. A shadow cast over me told me the commander walked alongside us. A forked tongue flickered out in amusement until he saw what I had been viewing. He emitted a low growl, and I obediently looked away. The journey continued, and they walked during the night. Hunger and thirst gripped my body. Judging by how their movements weren't slowed and how they navigated the broken roads, they could see in near darkness. I couldn't see where we were going. We passed a gate, and I could smell the foul aroma. I was wrong about what they were, and we passed a broken chain-link fence and a large wall made out of a material I didn't recognize. It shone brightly compared to the dull contrast of the faded concrete and metal made by humans. There were no symbols or decorations. A large square building stood in the center. I saw and smelled the body parts as we walked past. Small mountains of human remains were piled high. I couldn't tell how they were classified. I saw humans surrounded by the infected, encircling them. They growled, pushing against the bars and acting as a cheap defense shield. If one human escaped, they would join their ranks and ensnare the others. Survivors were locked in cages, staring off into space. Each was entirely in its own hell, and I wondered if they were injected with the same thing I was. I heard beeping and growls behind me, and I was led inside. They didn't bother to conceal themselves with human face masks, and inside the building, it was harder to breathe. I gasped and struggled, only to have a tube shoved down my throat. I was placed on a cold metal slab, and the foot soldiers left. The commander tossed the human mask off his face. and another of his kind stood over me. They spoke in their language of growls, their teeth bared, and I was taken in. I wanted to ask what was happening. Looking around me frantically, my head was unable to move, and I was placed inside a tube filled with a thick gel that prevented me from moving. My breathing tube was high above me, and I felt a sharp burn and feel of new air thrust into my lungs. 3 of them stood beneath me, studying me and talking between themselves. I saw other people in tubes, without knowing why any of us were here and not taken to the cages outside, in similar positions that I was in. A sharp needle penetrated my stomach. I wanted to wince, struggle, or move away, but was frozen, locked in place. I could feel a liquid being pushed inside me. I waited to feel any sensation that could indicate what it could have been. Time no longer mattered in here. There was no sun, nor any indicator of how much time had passed. I watched and waited in uneasy limbo. One person was removed from their tube, placed on the metal gurney, and led away from the tubes. I didn't see them again, nor did I know what was happening to them. The powerlessness was torture. I screamed in agony and would have thrashed around with my body, yet it was internal. Every time I shouted inside my mind, they seemed to know and would regard me closely. But after a while, they stopped caring, and I stopped screaming. It was useless. The injections had become more frequent now, one after another. I couldn't feel anything anymore, neither hunger nor thirst. I wondered whether I was able to function without them. The other humans I saw lost all their body hair, their muscles wasting away, and it looked like they were fading into nothing. A fate I knew I shared. The empty torment continued, and I finally felt movement. The gel inside the tube moved down, and there was a slow sludge sound. It was the first time my skin was exposed to the air, and I felt a sharp, burning sensation all over my skin. I winced in pain, and my jaw hurt, using atrophied muscles that hadn't been used in some time, and they strained under the pressure. The pain persisted, and only eased when it went limp. I had been placed inside a large metal box with an open lid and a small hole where the gel drained with a loud squelching sound. To my horror, another human was emptied. The gel coated me before turning into a sticky liquid, her body landing on top of mine. The first human contact I had in a lost amount of time. Equally, she didn't move. Only an exhausted whimper escaped her lips. One by one, more humans were emptied on top of us, and the grim realization that we were failed experiments sank in. I closed my eyes, imagining my family standing close to me and welcoming me into the afterlife. I did not wish to give them the satisfaction of knowing my last thoughts or seeing my fear. Ash and heat only increased with each footstep towards the incinerator and blasted our ears. While painful, I hoped that death would be quick, and I could hear the others. One by one, an alien, a more oversized and bulky type, reached inside and flung one of us into the flames. Uncaring, business as usual, it stopped and leaned on the wall, lighting up a piece of plastic and inhaling it. I lay in the metal box, the last survivor, and could feel the sweat coating my body. A loud sound of alarm moved through the structure. It tossed the plastic to the side, lifted me up, and threw me inside. The metal burned the left side of my body as I gripped on, surprised that I still managed to hold on as the alien fled down the hallway. A gas filled the chamber of the incinerator, and I lost control. Death, the sweet mercy, had come to claim me. The smoke made me dizzy, high in fact, and I smiled. Euphoric bliss filled me, and I wasn't sure of the source. The incinerator was cooling down, happy to live how I wanted to before the end. I heard fleshy movements behind me. I closed my eyes, ignoring it and waiting for death to claim me, when I felt a hand around my wrist. It pulled me down, ripping the burnt skin from my left side, and I felt strong arms around me. I tried to see my rescuer, but their face was concealed. I saw flashes of a long tunnel and blood on the walls, and each rocky footstep made it difficult. I heard barking in the distance, smiled and murmured, "Vic." Around me were the sounds of warfare, alien and human screaming, the firing of both kinds of weaponry. I was injected, wrapped in blankets, and looked over to see the aliens being skinned and crucified. Their bodies hung up on the walls with their flayed skin. My masked rescuers kicked the alien children, who whimpered and threw themselves into cages, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt despite what had been done to humanity. I leaned on a wall, a spectator for the carnage, and felt a weight on my leg. I looked down to see Victor, his head now coated in gray and cloudy dots in his eyes. But it was him. "Guess you finally came back," I whispered, raspy with forsaken vocal cords, and kept watching the bloodshed around me.
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you